Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story, Taiwanese President Lai Ching-Te raising a record-breaking group of nearly 50 lawmakers attending a key summit in Taipei, despite Beijing trying to block their trip. An at least 2-week delay in higher U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports, including electric cars, batteries, and computer chips. What will the holdup mean for the economy and your wallet? Washington announcing $500 million of military funding for the Philippines. The U.S. Defense Secretary saying the cash sends a clear message of support to Manila.
This is really designed to support the modernization of Filipino forces, Coast Guard, as they transition to focus on external defense.
And how does the Chinese Communist regime keep the money flowing during economic downturns? A former top official revealing an unusual strategy. More on what he says is the true motive behind China's anti-corruption campaign. The largest ever delegation of foreign lawmakers visiting Taiwan on Tuesday. Taiwanese President Lai Ching-Te welcomed them to Taipei, the capital of Taiwan. But their arrival came with opposition from China. Before some of the lawmakers embarked on the trip, Beijing officials pressured them not to go.
It also sends an important message to democratic countries around the world. Maintaining democracy requires unity, and we must protect democracy together. We have proven with our actions that we are willing to work hard to fight against the expansion of authoritarianism.
49 representatives from 23 different countries are attending. It's the largest ever group of lawmakers to visit the island at once. Lai made his remarks at a conference in Taipei held by the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, or IPAC. The alliance includes hundreds of lawmakers from a total of 35 countries, all concerned with how democracies should approach Beijing. Lawmakers from at least 6 countries said that Chinese diplomats pressured them not to attend the conference. One lawmaker from Bosnia said that Chinese diplomats messaged the head of her party with a demand to stop her from traveling, calling it, quote, really not okay. Beijing views Taiwan as part of Chinese territory and has been upping its threats to annex it by force if necessary. The Chinese Communist Party has never ruled Taiwan. Lai's party doesn't seek independence from China, but maintains that Taiwan is already a sovereign nation. China has ramped up pressure against the island since Lai took office in May, staging a large military drill as an effort to intimidate the island during his inauguration. That's on top of near daily aircraft incursions into or near the island's air defense zone. The Biden administration says higher tariffs on certain Chinese imports will be delayed by at least 2 weeks. This includes electric vehicles and their batteries, computer chips, and medical products. The U.S. Trade Representative's office said in May they would affect on August 1st, but on Tuesday, the office said it's still reviewing 1,100 comments received and expects to make a final decision in August. The office said the new tariffs will take effect roughly 2 weeks after the final determination is made public. The U.S. will provide $500 million in military funding to the Philippines. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced the news on Tuesday. That's as Washington works to boost ties with Manila amid its maritime tensions with Beijing.
This is really designed to support the modernization of Filipino forces, Coast Guard, as they transition to focus on external defense.
The defense spending will total nearly $4.5 billion US, accounting for 4% of the government's overall budget. The budget secretary said the funding will be dedicated to upholding the Philippines' sovereignty and territorial integrity. This comes after tensions between Manila and Beijing have risen in recent months. Chinese ships have been spotted blasting their Filipino counterparts with water cannons. The Philippines also accuses Chinese boats of ramming its own. A Filipino sailor sustained a major injury during one of the altercations. The Philippines also recently reached an arrangement with China about its resupply missions to a shallow area in the South China Sea. It's called the Second Thomas Shoal by China and the Anguian Shoal by the Philippines. Manila maintains a stranded naval ship there with troops stationed on it. Despite the agreement with China, the Philippines said it will keep asserting its rights in the South China Sea. China claims nearly all of the body of water. A ruling by an international court in 2016 found that Beijing's expansive claims had no basis under international law. China rejects the ruling. Washington is reinforcing its nuclear commitment to defend an Indo-Pacific ally, Japan. The two just held their first meeting on extended deterrence in Tokyo over the weekend. The commitment, also known as the Nuclear Umbrella, aims to protect U.S. allies from both nuclear and non-nuclear threats. Chinese state media warn that Japan risks becoming a potential nuclear target due to its alliance with the U.S. How will the nuclear strategy work out? We tap Grant Newsham, retired Marine Colonel and author of When China Attacks, for more. Grant Newsham, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Well, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
The U.S. and Japan are set to hold high-level security talks on nuclear deterrence. Now, how will that work, especially given the rising aggression we're seeing from Beijing and North Korea in that region?
Well, it's the Japanese who've really pushed for these talks. They are very concerned about the level of U.S. commitment, and they want to know that the Americans are willing to go all out and to use nuclear weapons if necessary to defend Japan. What's interesting here is the Japanese have pushed for nuclear disarmament or non-proliferation for a long time. They point out they're the only country that's ever been hit by nuclear weapons on 2 occasions in 1945. But you'll see that they're very willing to have the Americans come and drop nuclear weapons on people if it will defend Japan. That does suggest Japanese pacifism is a sort of a strange form of pacifism. But it was, as I said, the Japanese who pushed this. And the Americans have got to tell them something that convinces the Japanese that the Americans are reliable.
Now, back in February, Beijing called for a, quote, no first-use treaty. Now, the U.S. has maintained a first-use policy as a way of coercive diplomacy or escalate to de-escalate. What would happen if the U.S. agrees to this no first-use?
Well, we will have handed the Chinese an early Christmas gift. There's no possible way the Chinese communists will live up to any agreement they make. It shows how the Chinese communists very well understand, say, American psychology, American character, whereas we like agreements. We think that living up to an agreement is a sign of moral superiority, if nothing else. While they think it's a sign of almost suicide on the part of the other party.
You actually just wrote a piece titled Trump Vance Foreign Policy, U.S. Helps Those Who Help Themselves. Now, I think you've mentioned before what we saw with Ukraine, but how would this play out in terms of a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
And what we're talking about is an article I wrote and had to do with Mr. Trump saying, well, Taiwan needs to pay us, or needs to pay more for their own defense. And that, of course, got the American foreign policy community's hair on fire. But the thing is, Mr. Trump had a point, is that Taiwan does not pay enough for its own defense. It doesn't do enough to defend itself. And it's a practical matter. Most of our allies don't either. And that is Mr. Trump's point, is that these countries need to do more for themselves. We have limited resources, and we're going to devote those to people that actually do their best to defend themselves. But as I said, this tends to get sort of misinterpreted, often intentionally by Mr. Trump's opponents. And the idea thinking is, well, the Taiwanese won't feel like the Americans will back them, thus they'll give up. The Chinese will have an easier time. And that could be how it's interpreted, but hopefully it's seen as a wake-up call by countries that want American help. And the more you do, the more help you're going to get. But there's no free lunches here. And unfortunately, that the time when we could get away with those things is pretty much over. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, et al. Combined pose a real threat to all of us.
Grant Newsham, thank you so much for your time.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
The European Union's foreign policy chief has a message for Vietnam. The EU has a direct interest in maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea, adding that it could help boost Vietnam's maritime security and cybersecurity capabilities.
We may say it's very far away. It's not very far away because 38% of all our imports and 22% of all our exports goes through the waters of South China Sea.
Vietnam is at odds with China over its boundaries in the South China Sea. The body of water is a crucial shipping waterway. Beijing claims almost all of the South China Sea as its own, despite an international court ruling that claim invalid. Vietnam has relied on military gear from China-allied Russia for decades, but since 2022 has been publicly saying it wants to diversify its security equipment. It's in talks with multiple countries, including in Europe, other possible defense supplies. A former official from China telling NTD how he witnessed an unconventional method he says Beijing uses to dredge up funds, especially during economic downturns. He says the method targets China's own officials and their wallets. In an interview with NTD, he said the regime is using its anti-corruption campaign to do it.
There are over 90 million party members in China. The regime investigated more than 4.7 million of them between 2012 and 2022. It's like 1 in every 20 party members is being investigated.
In 2021, Beijing revealed that across 3 corruption cases, officials had fraudulently amassed hundreds of millions of dollars each. One of them had collected about $1.4 billion. Zhou is a former official himself. He said that by jailing just one high-ranking corrupt official, Beijing can collect the fraud money and absorb millions of dollars.
Those nearing retirement don't hold much value to the authorities. As for those who have retired, their corruption is now being looked into and backtracked 20 or even 30 years after retirement.
Zhou said that around 70% of the retired officials from his generation have been locked up. This year, multiple local governments in China under the Chinese regime started backtracking taxes from up to 30 years ago. Some speculate it's being used to combat China's struggling economy. A new warning about Russian disinformation. Top U.S. intelligence officials said Monday that Americans could be spreading false claims about the presidential race without their knowledge.
Disinformation could focus on candidates or voting or on hot election topics like immigration, crime, or the war in Gaza. Officials said ways of spreading misinformation include fake websites designed to mimic U.S. news outlets and AI-generated social media profiles. That's because people are more likely to trust and repost information they perceive coming from a domestic source. Intelligence officials warn that Russia, Iran, and China are directing propaganda against American democracy. The chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee said this latest warning shows the U.S. election is in the bullseye of bad actors across the globe.
That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for 3 years. If you'd like to support us, consider donating. Find us at donorbox.org/China-in-focus or subscribe to our partner platform Epic TV, where you can watch our full episodes. Just click the link down below. Here's what to look out for in our second half. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni pledging to relaunch ties with China. A look at her first trip to Beijing since taking office, plus expert insight.
I think it's a little bit of rhetoric, no, and a little bit of diplomacy, because Italy's relationship with China in terms of trade is enormous.
Renewable energy incentives in Thailand are fueling a boom for Chinese electric vehicle makers. But now the local auto sector is struggling with oversupply. And from the icy Arctic to the vast Pacific, Russia's Navy is conducting massive drills involving 300 ships and 50 aircraft. That's coming up. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you tomorrow.